Welcome to Mind Money Balance. I'm your host, Lindsay Bryan-Podvin. I'm a woman of color, popcorn connoisseur, and one of the first financial therapists in the United States. This is the weekly podcast all about making money feel good in your relationship. The no guilt, no shame podcast, so you can stand in your power as a couple. Let's go. Today's podcast is a little bit different because it has to be. There is a reason I open my podcast with the words, I'm a woman of color. And given the racial revolution that we are seeing happen in the United States and worldwide, it would be so negligent of me to not address it and to share with my listeners, my followers, where I'm coming from when I say that, and to offer this space to think about and talk about these things. Before we dive in, I'm going to throw out a few definitions so that as we move through this episode, you will know what I'm talking about. And these definitions were adopted from the website racialequitytools.org. So you are welcome to head there and check them out. They have lots of information and resources if you are new to this work or if you've been doing this work for a long time and just want a place to go to kind of check everything out. So let me start off with some definitions. The first one is BIPOC, which is the acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, Person of Color, or People of Color. And this used to be called POC, or Person of Color, or WOC for Women of Color. But what a lot of advocates were finding was that kind of excluded the different experiences that Black folks and that people who are native to the United States, Canada, and Mexico experience. Their experiences were so different from other people of color that it minimized their experience, which is why we now have the acronym BIPOC. So that's what that stands for if you hear it. A feminist is a person who believes that men and women should have equality and equal opportunities. Cultural appropriation means taking things from a different culture, a culture that is not yours, without an understanding, acknowledgement of, or respect for its value in its original culture. Privilege is social power that just happens within a society to all members of a dominant group. In the United States, the privilege you hear the most about right now is white privilege, and privilege that we also talk about a lot is the privilege of being male. It is usually hard for people who fall into those groups to acknowledge it because we're really not taught to see it. It is just what we are trained to understand as being the norm or being the default. And even without it being something that somebody purposely does or gets, they still have an advantage over those who do not fall into those certain groups. Intersectionality or intersectional is really when we talk about something and we look at it through a multifaceted lens. For example, we would consider things like gender, ability, both physical and mental ability, race, socioeconomic status, etc., and think about how all of those things are intersected with one another and how they interact with people's lives, both on an interpersonal level and also in broader societal systems. So before we kind of dive into it, I want to share with you that I am an intersectional feminist, which means that I am a person who believes that men and women should have equal opportunities and equity, and that I take into consideration that there are more things than just gender if we want to truly have equality in our society. And so that means including things like, again, a person's ability, a person's race, a person's language, a person's physical and mental ability, a person's class, etc., etc. And I'm sure that I've left out other classifications. I'm just giving this as a primer of where I'm coming from and why this is important and why I need to talk about it. So let's talk about it, okay? Race and money are intertwined. When we look at our nation's history, I'm American, I'm in the United States, there are hundreds of years of purposeful exclusion of Black people, brown people, and indigenous people from the tools and resources and systems they need to fully live their lives. Every industry is impacted by this. Housing, schools, banks, healthcare, employment. There is really no area intersected with money that isn't impacted by race. I was attending a virtual retreat about a month ago now, and it's called the Statement Event, and it's about women in money and media. And one of the panelists there was Ashley Ford, and she helped to define privilege in a way that I think might be helpful. And Ashley Ford said, hard work means you made good choices. Privilege means you had good choices. Unquote. I'm going to say that again. Hard work means you made good choices. Privilege means you had good choices. Unquote. So as a reminder, white privilege does not mean you haven't experienced trauma, heartache, or had horrific things happen to you. It simply means that your race was not a contributing factor to that trauma, heartache, or painful experiences. I identify as brown, as I mentioned in my intro. I identify as a woman of color. I am biracial, I'm Filipina and white, and I have the privilege of being able to use my racial ambiguity and light skin to pass in a lot of scenarios, okay? When I say pass, I mean that in areas where there are not BIPOC folks around, people can assume that I am a tan white person. They might say like, oh, you must be Spanish or Italian. And that means that I have firsthand knowledge of what happens when white people think that BIPOC folks are not around. I also have a ton of privilege because even though I am biracial, I grew up in a white household. My mom and dad are white. If any of you guys understand how adoption works, you know how that works, okay? I don't have to explain it. But I grew up in a white household, meaning my siblings were white, my parents were white. I grew up, as I mentioned, in a place that was white. So I know what it's like to access white spaces and white privilege, and I undoubtedly benefited from it. I had parents who talked to me about money, who trusted the banks, who paid for my higher education, who were able to provide me with access to preventative health care, connect and network me with people who had access to jobs, etc., etc. And when I say I'm a woman of color at the beginning of this podcast, I am letting you know that I'm willing and able to talk about race, even if, or especially if I mess up. So when you hear me say I'm a woman of color, I'm letting you know you cannot tell me how I identify or how you perceive me racially. When I say I'm a woman of color, I am offering that little nugget of wisdom for you, the listener, so that you know that me, the person who's doling out advice and information, I'm taking into consideration all of the things that come along with being a woman of color in the United States. I've had a complicated relationship growing up with the way that I present. Growing up as Filipina in a white family meant I was often lost on who exactly I was. I grew up in a rural town in the thumb of Michigan that was over 98% white. I adopted other cultures simply because I had no idea what it meant to be Filipino. In retrospect, I'm sad to say that I appropriated a lot of cultures in my youth as I tried to figure out and navigate what it meant to be brown. I continue to learn more about my heritage, and as I learn about being Filipino American, I find that I'm not alone in straddling the lines of belonging. And I imagine plenty of other non-white Americans experience this same feeling of not being Asian enough, or not being white enough, or, not being Black enough, or not being American enough, etc., etc. I talk all the time about spending in alignment with your values. And if you ever doubt what me and my business stands for, I want to be crystal clear. I stand against racism. I believe Black Lives Matter, and I believe that right now we need to be putting our energy and effort towards hearing Black folks and towards advocating for them if we have the privilege of being a non-Black person of color or a white person. And I say that again, knowing that being a woman of color doesn't give me a pass to not do this work. And I guess I should have defined work at the beginning of this podcast, but I'll do it now. When I talk about work, I am talking about learning more about systemic racism and contributing to the undoing of upholding of white supremacy in not only just in my interpersonal relationships, not only with my friends and family, but beyond, in the companies that I'm purchasing from, in the politicians that I'm voting for, in the spaces that I exist in and interact with, making sure that I'm taking stock of what is upholding this white supremacy and what can I do interpersonally and systematically to help. So being a woman of color doesn't give me a pass to not do this work. Living in a liberal city doesn't give me a pass to not do this work. For those of you who don't know where I'm recording from, I am recording from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which, depending on the year, is one of the most liberal cities in the United States. We usually fight with Berkeley, California for being the most liberal city. But even then, what does that mean? We're still 70% white here in Ann Arbor. We are still largely segregated. The north side of town is where most Asian and Asian American folks live. The heart of Ann Arbor is mostly white, and then you have other Black and brown folks kind of sprinkled on the outskirts of this city. So living here doesn't mean I don't get to do this work. The other thing that doesn't give me a pass to not do this work is voting and donating. But voting and donating money towards progressive causes does not give me a pass to not do this work. So let's also talk about how white privilege shows up in the two big industries that I do my work: personal finance and mental health. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. I have a few bullet points for the mental health and personal finance industries, but more or less this is really off the cuff because I do think it's important to have these conversations and to show you that we can have these conversations even when we're having them in an imperfect way. So let's start with psychology or mental health and talk a little bit about how white privilege shows up in this space. So we know that all cultures have a fascination with the human mind, and there have been centuries of various ways that different cultures explain why we are here on Earth. However, Western psychology, as we really know it today, came from white Western Europe. It was started in the late 1800s. Most of you guys know the name Sigmund Freud, and his jam was all about analyzing the subconscious and dreams, and it was really started to help out the hysterical woman. Carl Jung was one of his proteges, but I guess it depends on how you want to look at it. He pulled a lot of his work, interestingly, from Greek mythology, from astrology, from the zodiac signs, right? So that's your Virgo, Leo, Capricorn, etc. things, okay? So Carl Jung pulled the archetypes of a lot of people from the zodiac signs, and we still base a lot of psychology around this, even though we don't really talk about it in our training. I was trained, my background is in social work, which means a little bit more of an interdisciplinary training. So I studied psychology, and when I say psychiatry, I'm not talking about I'm a psychiatrist. I'm saying we studied how medication impacted the brain. So I studied areas of psychology, areas of psychiatry. We studied privilege, oppression, racial justice, social justice, how all of these systems are intertwined. We talked about culture, about language, about all of the things that interact with a person, right? The biological, the social, and the psychological in a person. But when it comes to psychology, we didn't really talk about the fact that it is rooted in the founders who are white dudes. And in present day psychology, we pull a lot from Eastern traditions, right? We talk about nonviolence and meditation and self-compassion. That's a big buzzy word right now if you are in therapy or if you're into psychology, but that pulls from Buddhist roots. So we are, in the world of psychology, we are inundated with scientific information, but we are forgetting that the roots of it come from other cultures, and we do not give enough credit to those other cultures. An example of how white privilege shows up in psychology is in this idea of non-disclosure. So in psychology, as a therapist, you are trained to not offer information about yourself to your clients. So if a client was to ask me about my race, I am supposed to say something like, "Why do you ask that? Why is that important for you to know?" And in that small little example, what we are showing is that our schools, our systems have decided that both the clinician and the client must be the norm, the privileged population, which is a white person. Do you see what I'm saying here? It is rooted in everything, and it is these seemingly innocuous things that contribute to privilege. So in school, when we're taught, don't disclose about yourselves, when we pose the question to our professors who are largely white, you can look up data on your own to see how many Black and brown folks are in mental health spaces. When we pose that question and we are told you're not allowed to tell anybody what race you are ignoring the fact that brown and Black people can't hide the fact that they are brown and Black, okay? So if a client asks me, "Lindsay, what race are you?" I'm not answering with, "Why did you ask that?" or "Why is that important for you to know?" I'm saying, "I'm biracial, I'm Filipina and white." And whether or not a client has thoughts or feelings about that is a part of the therapeutic process, and it is not for me to hide my culture, my race from them. So that is just one super small, itsy bitsy example of how white privilege shows up in psychology. Now let's talk about personal finance. How does white privilege show up in personal finance? Well, there's basically a long list. And I don't even know if, to be honest, I have the energy to go into it. So I'm just going to list off all the areas where race and white privilege are intersected with our money. Google these things. Google the word I'm about to say plus race, plus racial inequity, plus racial disparity, okay? And you will see that there are so many things that happen within the personal finance space that exclude or make it harder for brown and Black people to have wealth and pass on generational wealth the way that people who have the advantage of white privilege don't have to contend with. Redlining. The idea that depending on where you are, if you are a Black person or a person of color, you may not be able to purchase a home or get a loan for the property that you're looking for, even if you are otherwise qualified. This was technically made illegal 40, 50 years ago now, but time and time again, banks, credit unions, lenders come under scrutiny for continuing these redlining behaviors. Personal finance and healthcare disparities, right? With COVID happening right now, we are seeing that more Black people are impacted by the effects of COVID. And That goes back to a lack of access to high quality healthcare. There are studies that show that physicians tend to dismiss Black people's pain, and so they are not treated in the same way. Their pain is not taken into consideration the same way it is for non-Black people. There are so many other things I could go into with healthcare disparities, but again, do your own work. Google healthcare disparities amongst minorities. Banking. We know that there are so much distrust with banking and Black and brown folks. Black and brown folks were excluded from banking from the jump. Voting and personal finance are intertwined. Purchasing houses and personal finance is intertwined. Being unbanked, payday loans, owning land, owning property is all intertwined with personal finance, and we cannot exclude race from this conversation. Your call to action: keep spending, saving, and investing in alignment with your values. And if you believe that all people are created equally, then we have to start shopping, saving, and investing with Black and brown companies, banks, investing firms, insurance companies, etc., etc. Right now, we really need to focus on the Black community, knowing that, again, we are all intersected. When we lift up our Black brothers and sisters, we will lift up other BIPOC folks as well, okay? I'll continue to do the same. I'll continue to shop and spend and save and invest in alignment with my values. Your other call to action is to vote. Your other call to action is to keep learning, be willing to mess up. I'm certain that in my podcast just today, I have said things that were incorrect. I will probably have to issue some sort of correction after this week. And it's not because I'm like not doing my work. I am doing the work, and I'm always willing to learn more and to unlearn. It's not just about learning, okay? It's about unlearning all the things that you thought were normal and learning what actually has happened in our country to get us to where we are today. Other calls to action: share stories from people who don't look like you, okay? Check your family and friends. This is the interpersonal stuff that you can do. If they say something that makes you go, huh? Like, it might be rooted in one of those isms, right? Racism, sexism, ableism, all of that stuff. Be willing to check them, and you don't have to. In fact, I would tell you not to say like, oh my gosh, you're being racist. Because guess what? Yelling you're racist at someone who might have said or done something racist likely isn't going to make them go, oh, gee, I sure was racist. I'm going to change. Instead, ask them something like, wait, what did you say? Can you explain that to me? What did you mean by that? Right? Because so often racism is so insidious that people don't know that they are engaging in it or perpetuating it. Those are some of my calls to action. I wanted to share with you why I open with I'm a woman of color. I wanted to share with you what my values and my company's values are. I wanted to share with you the belief systems that I stand in. And yeah, we can't talk about money. We can't talk about mental health if we don't talk about race. Thanks for listening. If you can't tell from that episode, I recorded it relatively quickly because I follow my energy, and my energy was high when I wanted to get this message out. And as I was quickly re-listening to it, I wanted to clarify something about my background, because this is super, super important to me, and I don't want to erase part of my story. When I said earlier in the episode that I'm adopted, I want to clarify. My biological mother raised me. My biological father, who is Filipino, did not. And so I was adopted by a white man who married my mother, and I consider that person to be my father. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't want to erase that part of my history. My biological mother is white. She's the one who raised me. I have 4 beautiful siblings that I am honored to have grown up with who are also white. So I did want to clarify that particular piece, that I am not adopted from the Philippines, in case that got lost. So thanks for understanding that and for allowing me to clarify a bit more. If you love this episode, take a screenshot and tag me on Instagram at MindMoneyBalance with your favorite takeaway. I love seeing what resonates with my listeners and sharing it in my stories. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week, right here. Neither the host or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, medical, or other professional information. If you want professional help, please seek it out.